She is the recipient of Peabody Awards, which are worldwide awards for excellence in storytelling, as well as the Edward R. Murrow Award, which is, you all likely know, is a reward for excellence in journalism. She has, since 2016, focused on immigration and in particular the plight of displaced persons in her reporting, and has in fact traveled all over the world and certainly all over the United States, meeting with not just displaced persons and refugees themselves, but in all participants in that process. How she got here today was actually a very recent article that she wrote talking about the secret history of family separation. And when I read that article, it was actually shared with me by a former colleague at the Department of Homeland Security, I was honestly stunned and blown away by the intensity of the research that she had conducted. Many of these were people that I knew, and she got it right down to the T, what was likely going on in the Department of Homeland Security. So I said, she must come to ground. And so here she is. Caitlin, all yours.
Hello. Thanks to everybody who was willing to share their Friday evening with me today. So I tend to start talks by answering a question that I'm asked very often, which is how and why did you come to cover immigration? And that story starts in Merced, California, where I grew up. It's an agricultural hub in the country. I think we're the second largest dairy producers in the United States, and we also produce lots of other produce, nuts and fruits and lettuces. And so I think I grew up with a different understanding than a lot of people about our relationship to immigration in this country. You know, literally seeing, rain or shine, migrant workers picking fruits and vegetables that I then saw in the grocery store, which is not to reduce, of course, the presence of immigrants to the work they do in a country, but to just challenge the kind of power dynamic or one-way street that you often hear described in our political debate, where you have a group of people who needs help, and the question is, should we or shouldn't we, when in fact the relationship is a lot more symbiotic and one that we, of course, benefit from as well. And so when I got to college, I studied immigration, and that was when I started to learn about the structures that I had grown up observing without fully understanding them, how they'd evolved over time, how they compared to other countries. And then I was really hooked because I came to see how immigration status, you know, much like race or socioeconomic status or gender, was also a structure that influences the entire trajectory of a person's life, and not just their life, but also their children's life, their children's children's lives. Immigration status follows us as we move through the world. So today, I'm going to focus on the issue of global displacement, which impacts 1 in 97 people on the planet. Who are currently displaced from their homes, including 30 million children. Those are really, really large numbers that are hard to wrap your mind around, much less begin to think about solutions. And so my approach as a journalist is typically to use that data as a guide to delve as quickly and deeply as I can into the human stories and the experiences of those who are impacted on all sides. So I'm going to talk about two refugees who I met earlier this year. Both of them fled to Poland after the Russian military invaded Ukraine. And although there's a lot that's very unique, which we'll get into, about the experience of Ukrainian refugees specifically, I think that these two stories help to put a spotlight on the inflection points that are inherent to the experience of anyone who's displaced. Do they get access to education? Do they get access to housing, to safety, to work, that carry, again, these generational consequences? So this is a photo of Ukrainians who are standing in line in Warsaw to register. And as you may know, millions of Ukrainians crossed into Poland in a kind of unprecedented way at the start of the war. So this is Irina Sitnik and her 6-year-old son, Nikita. Irina is a taxi driver. Her father was a taxi driver. She grew up loving cars, and still to this day, walking down the street, loves to point out, there's a BMW, there's an Alfa Romeo, there's a Volvo, there's a Volkswagen. It's a real passion for her. She actually married one of her clients named Ruslan, and they had together their little boy, Nikita. Ruslan was a mechanic. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, like just about everybody in the country, she panicked, didn't know what to do. She called her older daughter, who was away at university, and her daughter wasn't able to get to Irina because the ATMs immediately stopped working, and so she found a way to get to some extended relatives who were living close by, and she basically moved into a dark and dank basement and stayed there for several weeks with very little food, leaving Irina to figure out what to do for herself and Nikita. So she packed a couple of bags of clothes and she hitchhiked across the border into Poland with $300 US. That was all of her savings, and no real plan. And she was taken in by a Polish family. This was very common. And in her case, by a family who took in more than a dozen people into this guest house that you see here, that was behind the primary home where the family lived. And one of the things I noticed right away when I got to Poland was that a lot of the Ukrainians who left first were actually the ones who had a lot of resources, who had money, who had contacts, who had the ability to move. And Irina got lucky because some neighbors were willing to take her along. But by the time I arrived, everybody else was gone from this house. They had managed to rent Airbnbs or to rent their own apartments or to move on to other countries. They had relatives in the United States or Canada or Germany. And Irina was stuck. And I interviewed the woman who was hosting her when I arrived, and she said, she's a working class girl. What can I do? And it sounds really harsh, but as a reporter, sometimes when people are that candid, it's actually really helpful because she was right. Being displaced was a horrible experience for all Ukrainians, regardless of what kind of resources they had available. But she was right that Irina was in a very different situation because of her socioeconomic status and because of the resources that she arrived with. So Irina did manage to get a job. She was working in a cafeteria at a private school, making around $2 an hour, so not enough to ever afford her own apartment for her and Nikita. And Nikita was really struggling as well. So he was first accepted for free into a private daycare, just sort of out of the goodness of the hearts of the people who ran it. But he started getting into fights with other kids, which had never happened before. He was really frustrated that he couldn't speak the language. He was waking up in the middle of the night, crying out for his dad. He was very confused. And so he was in a second school by the time I arrived that was also already threatening to kick him out. And so Irina is sort of running on fumes, and she's a total Energizer bunny, and it's kind of amazing to watch her traverse the city of Warsaw and try to figure out what's next for her and her son. But she was very overwhelmed. As Ukrainian nationals, they had access to 18 months of legal status in Poland, as well as to enroll in public schools for kids who are old enough, to utilize the healthcare system and the benefits of living in the EU legally and temporarily. But in order to take advantage of these things, they needed to register. And the government offices, one of which is depicted here, had hours-long lines outside of it every day. And Irina had a 2.5-hour commute between getting her son to school and herself to her job, which she actually wrote down here. You can see in the photo because she was so nervous about getting lost. She also didn't speak Polish. She had some Russian, but really spoke primarily Ukrainian because of where in the country she grew up. And so was also sort of figuring this out without being able to communicate with most people. She told me about a day where after work she decided to brave the government offices and try to go and register her and Nikita. And she got lost, and then her phone died, and it was actually the day that President Biden was in Warsaw, so a lot of the streets were closed, and so she had no idea how to get back to where they were staying. She just sat down on a park bench with Nikita on her lap and started crying. Eventually, a police officer found them and brought them back to where they were staying. So I had a lot of questions about Irina when I arrived in Warsaw about where she was going to end up. Was she going to be able to legalize, or was she going to remain undocumented? And how long was her host, who didn't sound like she was willing to let them stay forever, how long was she going to be patient? So all those were open questions. Then I met Nduka. He arrived in Ukraine in the 1990s as a university student, and he was studying sciences, wanted to become a doctor. His father died when he was in the middle of his schooling, and so he could no longer pay for that education, but by then had a Ukrainian girlfriend who eventually became his wife and the mother of his 2 kids, and so he decided to stick around undocumented. He told me that, as an undocumented immigrant in Ukraine, the question is not like, what do you do for a living? It's what don't you do for a living? So he did anything and everything that he could to try to support his family, anything from buying shoes that were used, cleaning them up, and then trying to sell them at an open arm market that was also frequented by African refugees in general. He did landscaping. He was a handyman. When Russia invaded Ukraine, he was on a job chopping timber in the middle of a forest. And so, he got in touch with, his ex-wife, who's still a good friend, and she was able to get the kids and take them to a safe place. And so he had to figure out what to do kind of on his own because they were so far apart from one another. So he hitchhikes to the border with Ukraine, with Poland rather. But he gets stuck, like a lot of non-Ukrainian nationals. He was not allowed to cross the border. And so he ends up living kind of in this makeshift community along the border for a couple of weeks. And he's rejected multiple times by border guards who basically tell them, we have to process the Ukrainians first and maybe we'll get to you. He and UN volunteers who I interviewed who worked with him told me about how he was harassed, all sorts of racial epithets and slurs were lobbed his way. He, at one point, told me a guy took out, and this was corroborated by a volunteer who was there, took out his cell phone and started filming Nduka and saying, look, they taught the monkey to speak Ukrainian, amid everything else that he's dealing with. But he actually said, this is not that bad compared to previous experiences that I had. In this photo, you can see he's showing me a scar from when he was attacked. There was a rash of violence by skinhead groups in Ukraine that he was subjected to. This incident left him in a coma for several months, and a friend of his was actually killed. So his attitude is basically, what can you do? I'll take what I can get is kind of what he kept saying to me over and over. So I met him at a hostel in Warsaw that was designated specifically for non-Ukrainians. They were not allowed to stay in shelters that the Polish government had set up in big stadiums, and they were also rejected from a lot of Polish households. And so you had in this hostel, you can see the flags up on the wall, people from all over the world. Because of their legal status and because of their nationality and their ethnicity, they were not eligible to that 18 months of remaining in Poland legally. They had 15 days to get out of the country. So they had to figure out what to do next. There were other European countries who'd set up bus trips to help relieve Poland of the pressure of the millions of Ukrainians who were there, and carry people to Germany, to Switzerland, to France, elsewhere. But those buses were also rejecting non-Ukrainians. And so Nduka and lots of other people were marooned at this hostel without anywhere to go. So his plan was to try to make it to Germany based on advice he got from these UN volunteers at the Polish border who said basically that's where you have the best shot of getting asylum. It's very, very hard to get asylum here. Go to Germany. He doesn't know anyone in Germany. He doesn't have any money to get to Germany. He doesn't speak German. He speaks English, French, Russian, and Ukrainian. But again, it was just this like, what can I do? I said, aren't you worried? And he's like, what can I do? So he's going to try to get to Germany. And so, I tell their stories, from the perspective of somebody who's covered displaced groups in different places. None of it is to say that any one Ukrainian's experience was anything less than horrific. To leave family members behind, to die, to fight, to give up a life that you that you've built was a universally horrible experience. And as an immigration reporter, I always point out, though, how, you know, your immigration status and your ethnicity and your nationality, it does influence where you get to land and what sectors of society you get to slot into as you begin to try to move forward from these experiences. So I should step back for a minute and talk about what was happening in Poland generally prior to the Russian invasion, because Poland accepted millions of Ukrainian refugees, but is not a country that does that typically, and including very recently. So as I see heads nodding, so some of you probably know that the leader of Belarus, Lukashenko, in recent years had begun encouraging Arab migrants to come to Belarus, not to welcome them there to enjoy, you know, the experience of living in Belarus, but to deliver them to the border of an EU country, you know, bring them to Poland. And the way that this was often reported in the media was that Lukashenko was trying to destabilize Poland by bringing all these Arab migrants to the border. And as a reporter, my job is to scratch at that a little bit, that language, because it presumes that the Polish society and Polish government would have crumbled under the weight of thousands of Arab migrants who needed somewhere to live because they were fleeing Syria, Afghanistan, and other places. They were also effectively refugees. I won't get into the legal definitions because I'm sure most of you know what they are, but colloquially, these are people who were fleeing violent situations. So the narrative around the Arab migrants who were trying to get into Poland reminded me a lot of what you hear a lot in the United States as well, right? It's that, well, it's not that we don't want to help asylum seekers, it's not that we hold anything against them in particular, but it's just too many people. We couldn't possibly do it. It's just too much. And I don't bring that up to minimize, you know, the significance of the very large numbers of people who want to come to the U.S. or the resources that requires. Those things are all very valid, but this argument of, like, we simply just couldn't possibly is often really reflexively deployed without any kind of debate or consideration of what an alternative might look like. And of course, we saw what an alternative looked like following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when millions of people went to Poland and were given access to social services and protections. And there is a lot of concern about what may happen in Poland long term. We still don't know. But the country was certainly functioning quite well while I was there. So let's see what I saw in Poland was not just unique for Poland. It was unique globally in the context of this global crisis that I'm here to talk about. And I noticed that right away. I noticed that before I even got to Warsaw. This is a picture that I took at the Charles de Gaulle airport in Paris because I had a layover of a woman who was a nurse based in Cape Cod who took leave from her job to go to the border with Ukraine. She didn't know any Ukrainian or Polish. She didn't know anybody there, but she fundraised in her community and was coming with these envelopes full of cash. So she planned to fly into Warsaw, rent a car, drive to the border, again, not speaking the language or necessarily knowing her way around, just to hand out cash to refugees. And I just thought, wow, I've never seen that before. And I continued to see it at the hotel where I eventually stayed. Initially, I stayed in a house that was housing refugees, and then I thought, let me give them a break and go to a hotel for a couple of nights. And I saw Americans there one man was a mortgage broker from Colorado, and he quit his job when Russia invaded Ukraine. And he just said, I have to go help. He was volunteering at a daycare that had been set up for free child care for Ukrainians who were trying to go through this process of legalizing so that they didn't have to, you know, carry their babies and their toddlers with them as they went through that process, which was an incredible resource to have available. Again, he didn't speak the language, he didn't know anybody, but he just rented an Airbnb using his own money and said he was just going to stay as long as he needed to. And I really saw that everywhere that I went, including in this first night in a bus station where nightly hundreds and hundreds of people were arriving in Warsaw, and their faces were shell-shocked. I came to recognize this expression where people's like eyebrows were truly like fixed up on their face because they, were deeply, deeply traumatized and had seen horrible things, grabbed what they could, got on a train, and got across the border to Poland, and they had no idea where they were going to go next. Many of them arrived, in tears and desperately worried about the relatives that they'd left behind. And they were greeted in this bus station by volunteers who provided for them hot food, who provided, snacks and water for later, who set them up with housing. There were some people who work in tech quickly created this software that was able to match people with, Polish households that it offered to house individuals. They were given taxi vouchers to be able to get around the city for free, free cell phone SIM cards, which is so important for people who are migrating and crossing borders to be able to stay in touch with their families. Therapists were on hand to talk to people with fresh trauma. And so the resources were really staggering. There was even pet food, and I took this picture because I also have a dachshund. And, they were getting treats and food. And when I would work on these stories, like 10 years ago, I never really got the pet thing. That probably sounds callous, but now that I have a dog, can you imagine? I mean, I would never leave my dog. And, the idea of like not being able to feed her is like so hard to imagine. And so, these considerations were made that really like thought of people as full people with kids and with dogs and who needed cabs. Again, lots of questions about how long these resources were going to last, but they were everywhere. And a lot of the places that I visited in Poland were actually dealing with like the organization of the massive amounts of resources that they had was the challenge, because they were getting so much donations and so many donations, and it was hard to know what to do with them. So this is at a stadium that was converted, like I said before, to a shelter specifically for Ukrainian nationals. And the bottom floor of this sports arena, where I think the White Stripes had played at one point, was basically typically used for concessions, but it was turned into like this free mall. So I took some pictures, this on the right side, you see those are all socks just for babies, toys, clothing for different ages set up. And this is me standing next to a volunteer, a young man from Canada who did the same thing, left Canada to go and volunteer when the war broke out. And you saw bathing suits, you saw towels, you saw sheets, you saw here you have baby carriages and car seats, all donated by people in Poland. And this area on the right is where cots had been set up for people to sleep, and they kept that room really quiet because people needed to rest. A lot of them had not slept since they fled their home. And so they just needed peace and quiet. They had Wi-Fi, they could plug in their phone, charge their phone, and kind of begin to process and think about what was next. And I'm skipping ahead here. So, when the war in Ukraine began, a lot of people who focus on this issue, who work for the UN, UNHCR, academics, maybe some of you are here, focused on this issue, were saying that they hoped the response to the mass migration out of Ukraine could serve as a model. And that's because it was so rare. And so to talk about an example of that, my version of covering this global refugee crisis for most of the Trump era took place in a very different context, right outside our doorstep, right outside the southwest border, where for the first time, refugee camps grew in response to restrictions on asylum. So this story I wrote in September of 2019, right after the American Supreme Court upheld a program with two different names for some reason called the Migrant Protection Protocols, or Remain in Mexico, that required asylum seekers to wait out their cases, which can take months or years, in Mexico rather than being allowed into the United States and either being detained or released into the country. So when I arrived there were hundreds of people outside sleeping, some in tents, some just kind of on the ground in a concrete plaza in Matamoros, Mexico, right across the border from like, the Rio Grande Valley, the Brownsville area. And it was very, very, very hot. So this is a little boy who seemed to have the flu, but also some heat stroke. There were women who'd given birth outside on this plaza because of new restrictions. Historically, if someone was pregnant, and especially if they were 9 months pregnant, they would be allowed into the country, but that was no longer the case. And already this group of people who was sitting and waiting were being targeted by cartels that have a lot of influence over this area. So people were being kidnapped, people were being mugged, people were being assaulted, kids were being forced to do the work of the cartels. And there were the volunteer presence was sort of sporadic. Sometimes volunteers would be there, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they'd be passing out free food, sometimes they wouldn't. There were a couple of groups in Mexico and a couple of groups in South Texas who were there, but I didn't meet anybody from Cape Cod. I didn't meet anybody from, mortgage brokers from Colorado. And the Mexican government was not working with the UN, so sort of doing the opposite, right? They didn't want a refugee camp in Mexico at all. And so, UN officials told me this was pretty unprecedented, but they refused to work together so that at least the UN could bring in resources that adhere to modern standards for, how to deal with displacement humanely, to deal with things like hygiene, sanitation, and basic needs. That wasn't possible. And so very unclear what's going to happen. When I returned several times, but these photos were taken about a year later, and by then the situation had completely metastasized. So you had camps that grew not only in Matamoros, but in other Mexican cities where you had thousands of people who'd been living for many months and in some cases for over a year. The camp in Matamoros had moved to a park that was adjacent to that concrete plaza, but within view of the United States. And, you had thousands of people living in donated tents. They had a couple dozen porta potties available to them. I would say at any given time, the majority were broken. The smell was incredibly overwhelming, especially given the heat. And, they were carrying water in buckets to go and try to bathe. For example, there were some showers, but again, often broken. And they had these big tanks that were set up to filter rainwater, but it wasn't happening very effectively because people were sick all the time. There were colds going around constantly, stomach viruses going around constantly. I would be sitting in someone's tent interviewing them, and I could hear people retching and vomiting and like the cacophony of coughs because it was like everybody was sick, and especially the kids kind of constantly. There was no access, as I said, to the basic hygiene and sanitation that you need to be able to live safely. So this is a baby who was covered in pockmarks from the heat. On the left here, you see a newborn who, if I had video, I watched her being washed in a little bowl, like a kitchen bowl. They're just trying to keep the dirt off of her, out of her diaper. On the right is another little girl who had a physical disability who, her mom was hoping to have treated in the United States, but you can see like little kids playing behind them, and they're sitting in the dirt, and this is how they were living. These kids were not going to school, so on the right here you see attempts from the refugees themselves to try to find some semblance of normalcy. So this is on the right a Cuban man who was a musician, and he just decided to teach some music class just to try to entertain the kids a little bit. On the left, there's this little boy who just stuck to me one afternoon all day for some reason. But you can see the balloons because someone's mom tried to do a little birthday party with what she could scrounge together from nearby stores, and the parents would pool their money to try to do something little for the kids because they were stuck for so long. And this is just one boy I met in Matamoros. His name's Alexander. He was 11, and he was from southern Mexico. He loved animals, and he loved science, and he loved to talk about it. So he took out a notebook that he wanted to show me because a volunteer group had come and done, just like a couple of days of class, not real school, but it just felt so good to him to be going to school, that he wanted to show off what he had learned and what he had written down. He told me he really missed that experience. I asked him, is there anything that you like to do? Is there anywhere that you like to play? He's like, no. Sometimes going down by the river is nice because there's at least a little bit of a breeze, because the heat was just unrelenting. I mean, I should have taken pictures of, like, I would, go just within a half an hour of being there, and I'm like drenched in sweat. And to have no reprieve from that was really exhausting. So I said, oh, it's nice to get some breeze by the river, but we're not really allowed by the river anymore because, the periphery is the most dangerous area. And by then, the cartel violence had completely taken off. This population, which was originally is like, oh, there's some new people around here who we can take advantage of. I mean, it was embedded, and everybody knew how unsafe they were, and there were hundreds of cases of horrific violence and kidnapping that were documented by human rights groups. So parents were doing their best to try to keep their kids safe by just keeping them close to the center of the camp and away from the water. So Alex's mother was there she had 2 other kids, and was telling me how they ended up there. So her family had been targeted. It wasn't exactly clear why, by a cartel that ran the community where they lived. Her brother had been kidnapped and murdered, which she showed me photos of. And other family members had been targeted, and her husband had also been physically abusive, she said, to her and the kids. And as she was telling me this, Alexander is standing behind her, but I can see over her shoulder that he's like gagging. And so I'm sort of trying to pause, is he okay? And she said, oh, don't worry, that's just like the trauma response. Every time I talk about this, he gets sick. That's just what happens, don't worry. So a deeply, deeply traumatized child living in circumstances that were exacerbating what he'd already been through. And he also hadn't been to school in over a year, nor had a lot of the kids living in Matamoros, because, they didn't have a free train ride to where they were headed, or a free bus ride to where they were headed. I mean, in many cases, it took months to get there. And the circumstances leading up to their displacement are different. But, I just conclude with this story to raise this idea that, as we grapple with this global problem, it's worth considering how different it can look depending on where you are, depending on who you're talking about, what resources are made available to them, and the consequences that come with that. Again, not just for Alex, but for his kids, and for his kids' kids. So, thank you. Yes, how did I do on time, by the way?
I can start asking questions, or if there are questions already from the audience, please come on up to the microphone and fire away. All right, I will start. One of the ways that the difference in experience between Ukrainians, including Ukrainians who have attempted to come to the U.S., and Central Americans, one of the ways that distinction is justified is to say, well, Ukrainians are obviously political refugees. Their country is being attacked by another country. They are clearly in danger. Although they live under a threat of violence, the migrants from Central America they're really economic refugees. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious in terms of the stories that you heard there, of the things, I mean, I know you pointed to one instance of domestic violence. what did you hear as to what were the stories that prompted people not only to get up and leave, but to endure what they were enduring in these camps in Matamoros?
I'm happy to share some of those stories, and I think you put the last part of that question really well. Like, what is it that would convince someone that it's worthwhile to live outside for over a year and have their kids out of school? Probably not just a higher paying job, right? So one of the things that I learned right away when I started reporting in Matamoros is that in each of those tents were, manila folders sometimes, or, just a few pieces of paper, but that were treated like gold. So when it rained, people would rush to their tents to make sure that their paperwork was okay, do anything that they could to try to protect it. They didn't have any furniture or anything like that, but to protect the documents that they'd learned to bring with them to make their asylum cases. And were there people there who were there because they were deeply poor and so could be considered economic migrants? Yeah, I mean, there are people who could not feed their children. There's a family in the story you referred to earlier where a 5-year-old girl was separated from her father during the Trump administration. And, he didn't really know that, what the difference was between asylum versus, a removal case, and can I qualify for this visa or that? I mean, the reality was he didn't qualify for any type of visa other than perhaps asylum status because he was so poor. But he was a subsistence farmer who had been living in good times on $4 a week and had 2 children and now has more. And so, when his field stopped yielding crops, he and his wife were hungry regularly, and so were their children. And, that's dangerous. But there are also lots of people, because of this, very well documented instability, very well documented conflict, gender-based violence, gang violence in Central America specifically, many people who have very direct threats that they face to their families, and they're sort of ready to show it to you as a journalist as soon as you arrive. Here's my paper, can you take a look at these documents that I have? People say, well, are they real and are they not real? And there's forensic research that immigration judges can do. But I'll give you one example. A family I met in Matamoros, I was in the middle of writing about them when one of them was kind of died mysteriously, and everybody in the camp assumed that he was murdered by the cartel. But it was a young man who was there with his wife and daughter and sister. So his paperwork included tabloid articles that he showed me from the 90s because his mother had given birth to the first set of triplets that were born in this particular hospital in Guatemala. And they were very poor, and so, it was covered in the media, and people from all over the world sent them, milk and sent them, supplies and resources to help, this mother raise her triplets. And the father was out of the picture. The mother, which was very common in their community in Guatemala, became sort of involved in the gang against her will, in that she was asked to do something that she didn't fully understand, and then at that point she was in, and then to try to get out put her in danger. So he comes home one day and finds one of his sisters and his mother dead, and his sister's baby wrapped in a sheet. And all of this was covered in lots of different news outlets, and he had access to all of them, but I also looked them up independently myself as I continued to report on them. So I should say one of the triplets had died. The second triplet was murdered at the same time that his mother was. And so he showed up in Matamoros with his grandmother, his wife, his baby, his sister's baby, and then the one remaining living sister who had a baby herself, which was the one that I watched being bathed in the bowl. And so this is a family that's gone through incredible tragedy, that's clearly been targeted very specifically. By the time they get to Matamoros, several other relatives had been murdered. And then he disappears mysteriously and is thought to have been murdered. So I go back to Guatemala for his funeral because his body is repatriated. And I mean, at the time I was at the New York Times, I mean, the level of security that I had, I mean, there were people who were constantly monitoring my whereabouts to make sure that I was okay. His relatives had to meet me in different locations every time I saw them, because they were so worried that anybody would find out where they were. And so we were, meeting in in secret locations that would change constantly, and even for me, and I would have to figure out how to get there. But but I couldn't have security with me because that would then draw more attention to us. So there was all kinds of effort made just to keep me safe there for a few days, and it was very clear that his extended relatives were living like this, had been living like this for years. So that's an example of the type of circumstances that lead people to end up in Matamoros, and it is very different from the situation that's incredibly clear-cut in many ways, right, in Ukraine. Although I'm sure that lots of academics at the time said, well, let's talk about the definition of refugee status, and it's actually a little different from what's happening here in Ukraine. Again, not to say that anybody isn't deserving of protection, but these definitions just simply no longer adhere to the geopolitical circumstances we're dealing with, and have left us kind of, as a country and globally, not equipped to deal with the mass migration that is underway. It's indisputable. As we continue to adhere to these old definitions, more and more people are displaced from their homes with nowhere to go.
Questions? So I have another question, and this is my favorite question of the day, which is sort of the unique role. Your role as not only a journalist but an investigative journalist, and you bear witness in a way that is sort of distinct from anybody else who is in government official, academic, an NGO worker. You're bearing witness in a particular way that I think is really important. I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about what responsibilities you feel in that role, and what you think your powers can be in that role.
So I love being a journalist, and I decided pretty early to adulthood during my college career that I wanted to become a journalist. And so I've always sort of identified politically as reporter, I think, more than anything else. Because I love the importance of the role that we play in society. And yes, it's imperfect, and yes, it's an industry that can and should get better like any other, but I believe in our mission really strongly, and I see that as a mission to tell people what is actually happening. And that doesn't necessarily sound all that hard or maybe all that necessary until you realize something that a colleague, I mentioned this earlier, in class used to say when I started out as an investigative reporter, and I was sort of getting advice from a mentor who'd been doing it for decades, and he had Peabodys coming out of his ears, and he said, Caitlin, all governments lie, or all governments spin.
And this is when you say no offense to me, right?
No offense, yeah, no offense. But in our political system, everybody, or almost all the players, other than people who are just doing their job and voting when they can based on the information that they have, they have an agenda that they're trying to push, and again, that's on all sides. And so what I love about what I get to do is just say, let me go figure out what's actually going on, and let me just tell people that. Let me empower them and give them the tools that they need to fully participate, and then they get to decide. And that means not just parroting the official narrative, whether it's Vladimir Putin's official narrative or whether it's President Biden's, whether it's the Trump administration who said for over a year they weren't separating families when they were, or different ways that the people living in Matamoros and the conditions there have been justified by multiple administrations at this point. So I just get to go and try to get to the bottom of it and do the best that I can, and hopefully also acknowledge the limitations, that I'm up against, especially when it comes to dropping into Warsaw, and not having a lot of reporting experience in Eastern Europe, and just saying, okay, I spent some time here, I interviewed as many people as I possibly could, and here's what I learned, and I hope this helps, inform your understanding of the situation. But that's fundamentally what I see my role as. Sometimes it's as simple as observation, and other times, like with family separation, it's 18 months of procuring government records and doing off-the-record interviews and begging people to open up and talk to me. I mean, sometimes it takes a lot of work, but at the end of the day, it's, I'm just trying to tell my audience what's going on.
Mr. Gorenser.
Thank you. Thank you for coming today. This has been great. Thinking about the agenda that you mentioned as important, that everyone has their own agenda, but as a reporter, when you're witnessing such tragedies and the problems, do you take into consideration the policy solutions, or is that a part of like how you're evaluating what you're seeing or thinking about where we go from here with these problems? And I have to say, I think that would be so challenging as someone who is an advocate, just working on the Hill in a previous life, how it would challenging be for me to not take that step as a reporter into the advocate waters.
Thank you for your question. I am often asked, come on, what do you really think? Like, come on, just tell me. I know you really have an opinion, and just tell me what it is. Or I'm often asked by people who are going into journalism, this same question. Don't you feel limited by what you're able to write in the New York Times? Don't you just want to, like, tell it like it is, or tell it like you see it as? And I don't feel limited. I actually feel an even greater sense of mission, I think, in moments like when families were being separated along the southwest border, because, first, like, who cares what Caitlin Dickerson thinks about that? I don't even really that much. It's just my opinion, I don't think is as critical. There are a lot of people who do really, really great column work and opinion work, and I enjoy reading some of them, and lots of people enjoy reading a lot of them. I mean, that stuff is very, very well read, but I think what's also critical and kind of essential as a first step before you get to that opinionated work is what is going on. And everybody needs to start with the same set of facts, which is becoming less and less common, right? And so as that occurs, I feel even more like I need to be reporting the news in a way that is accessible to everybody, that tries not to alienate anybody, but that also is very critically honest about what's going on, that takes into account that advice that I got from my colleague that all governments lie, because we do have to be skeptical of the official narrative regardless of where it comes from. And so I see that as almost freeing or an opportunity, and again, like, it gives me this sense of mission that can help me stick with it during difficult times. I do sometimes think about solutions, especially sticking with an issue for as long as I have, and that can be part of the work, because it's a political issue, and so politicians are considering doing X or Y, and okay, I'm going to report that out, and what would the consequences of that be, and would it work or wouldn't it, and how would people feel about it? So I do start to think about solutions to the extent that they're being debated, or they're part of the story. But I like that I get to hold back opinions and just spend way more time figuring out what other people think about these things, because I just think that's endlessly fascinating, way more than what I think.
Hi, thank you very much for being here today. I have a question about your comment that we're talking about people on the move in ways that are no longer applicable or relevant or helpful. And I'm wondering what you see in your work that would inform how we might talk about them differently.
Sure, thank you. So I'll talk about how we deal with displaced people in the United States, and forgive me for anybody who already knows all of this, but our modern asylum system comes out of World War II and a global reckoning that happened because Jewish refugees were turned away from many places, including the United States, who were told, nothing against you guys, basically, but you haven't followed the process. You haven't applied for a visa. You have to get in line. We have a system. We can't just let you in willy-nilly, sorry. And people were sent back to die. And so fast forwarding several decades, ultimately what's codified into a statute here in the United States following our signing on to a UN charter is our modern asylum law, which says that, anyone, regardless of how they enter the country, is entitled to apply for protected status. And what they have to do is prove that they meet a set of requirements, that they face persecution based on their specific circumstances, their nationality, their religion, for example, their ethnicity, and then, the really sticky one, the membership in a particular social group, and what does that mean? And so judges in the last several decades have expanded the definition of a particular social group to include, for example, women who are subjected to gender-based violence in Central America. In some cases, children who are targeted by gangs and gang-related violence. And in general, to people who live in countries, not just Central America, but elsewhere, who, where the government is unwilling or unable to protect them, where the government is sometimes complicit in that violence. And people too fleeing ISIS, for example, were not, that's a non-state actor. That's not the group that we had in mind when our asylum laws initially evolved. The Cold War is also really critical, right? Because yes, the asylum statute comes out of World War II and this desire to not repeat a mistake, but it also is codified sort of conveniently at a time when the United States is trying to stand up globally for democracy and in opposition to other types of government like communism. And so it becomes a bit of a communications tool, right? A way of sort of saying, we're a better country than you are, Cuba, for example, because look at people who are fleeing communism in your country and coming to the United States for protection. And so there's a messaging aspect to it as well. It's not just something that's been deployed and offered to people in a kind of benevolent way. But the evolution that has taken place has been very spotty. Certain federal court, help me, the federal court, not a district, but it's bigger than that.
It's the
Circuit.
circuit, yeah.
Yeah, so it's circuit by circuit. Some circuits will take an asylum case from somebody who's been subjected to gender-based violence. Other circuits won't because, it's judge to judge. And as we all know, administrations in recent years are putting a lot of effort into changing who are federal judges and who set these statutes. Then we had, under the Trump administration, Jeff Sessions attempt to change the story again and revoke the ability of federal judges to grant asylum status to, for example, people who are victims of gender-based or gang-based violence, basically saying, this is a civics issue. This is an issue that, your country needs to figure out on its own, but it's not war, it's not conflict, it's not, Putin invading Ukraine, so you're no longer entitled. That was then challenged in court. So we haven't agreed as a country on who should be eligible and who shouldn't. But the system is fundamentally biased toward, this version of displacement that comes from, between the 1940s and the 1980s. And the world has changed really dramatically since then. And so I think in my work, what I've seen is that needs to be addressed.
And if I can jump in for just a second in my sort of immigration lawyer role and step out of the moderator barrier. In fact, the judges that are making these decisions are not judges in a courthouse the way we would ordinarily picture. They are judges who are actually U.S. Department of Justice employees. So when Jeff Sessions decided to change the standard for who was a refugee and really, shrink to close to nothing the ability for a gender-based violence victim, a gang violence victim, to close to zero, he could do that because he was the boss of all of those judges as a pure matter. And so this issue is kind of unfortunately flip-flopped from administration to administration. because of that particular authority that the Attorney General has in making that decision. That was then challenged in real court. And it did go up to the appellate courts, which is where, you know, that issue finally was put to some sort of right, course corrected pretty significantly by the courts at that point.
And then we can talk about why, you know, immigration judges are DOJ employees, and the way that we treat, you know, immigration as a proceeding civilly and not criminally, which has all kinds of other consequences,
Right.
you know, which explains why someone in immigration court isn't entitled to a public defender or a jury of their peers. So
Yes, we could, and we should. I mean, you know, what I'll, you know, as somebody who was an operative in the system, you know, the fact is that the consequences in immigration court are on par with the criminal justice system in terms of how thoroughly life-changing those consequences can be. So I think that the point you raise is a critical one. But let me step back into my moderator role and see if we have any other questions. If not, I have, oh, good.
Yeah, thank you so
This
much
is
for
Blair
this
Sackett, who's a postdoctoral fellow here at Watson.
great talk. And I really appreciate your use of looking at the Ukraine case in Poland and Matamoros in the US. And I was sort of wondering, in thinking about that, the US would be playing sort of the role as Poland, and what could the US learn from Poland and how they've received Ukrainian refugees? So sort of going back to the solutions, and did you see anything that could be carried elsewhere?
thank you for your question. There's always a point in a public talk when I have to say, I'm not talking about open borders, because people completely panic and love to talk about open borders. And I've never actually heard anybody advocate proactively for open borders, but like the fear of open borders is just, it haunts me in my dreams because I hear it so frequently. So, but what actually happened in Poland was open borders. I mean, they were barely checking anybody, right? And it was just like, you know, Ukrainian passport, you're in, Ukrainian passport, you're in, Ukrainian passport. And it showed, like I said, it poked a hole in this argument that, you know, it would just be impossible for the Polish government to process, you know, 10,000 Afghan refugees or 20,000 Syrian refugees. And I should have mentioned that, I don't think I did, you know, our refugees were freezing to death and dying in the forest in Belarus outside of Poland. You know, they were facing water cannons. The Polish border guards were using water cannons against them to keep them out because of this argument again. Well, we just couldn't possibly handle it. And it's just not true. It's a choice. And it's also a choice for the United States government to handle immigration the way that it does. And so whether we're talking about the Biden administration or the Trump administration, I hear all the time, Border Patrol stations are overwhelmed. The Border Patrol is overwhelmed. They can't handle it. And they are overwhelmed. I mean, I've been in those Border Patrol stations, and there's a lot of people, and you know, there's not enough people to do the work that needs to be done. But our federal government is very large and has a lot of money to play around with, and a lot of people who, by the way, work in different fields, not enforcement, you know, not policing, but you know, in HHS, for example, where the focus is really on migrant children and making sure that their rights are protected. You know, how many lawyers would sign up to become federal public defenders if it meant working on immigration cases? I mean, there's a lot of eagerness to, and a lot of resources that could be dedicated to addressing this issue in a more humane way, and that just simply aren't. And so I think it starts with acknowledging that that is a choice. You know, we started talking about it a little bit under Trump, you know, the creation of a crisis. But that is in many ways still true. And you know, there was also just this sort of societal cultural thing going on in Warsaw. Like I said, people really didn't seem to have talked about it very much, right? They just kind of said, of course we're gonna take people in. The couple who was housing Irina and Nikita, they said they barely had a conversation about it. You know, they signed up to house people, you know, a few days later, I think it was 13 people showed up in a truck and just kind of filed out, and they just went, okay, we're gonna figure this out. And I remember that the host told me that Nikita was carrying a little stuffed cat, and it just broke her heart because she had young kids too, and she thought, like, so this is what you grab, you know, when you're in a hurry and you're running out of your house.
Nikita grabbed a stuffed cat, and that's what he had with him. And so she was thinking of him, and thinking about her own children and the relationship between them. And Polish people were really open about the fact that part of the reason they were so moved is because a lot of them felt like, well, we might be next. And like, I hope somebody in France lets me through, or, wherever they were able to go. And so, decisions about how displaced people are received or not often come down to shared identity. I think that's been shown over and over again. Do you feel like you have something in common with this group of people? Pan-Americanism, people don't really remember that, but prior to 1965, based on this notion that Mexico was our neighbor, and therefore, we should help people out, not to say that our relationship or treatment of people coming from Mexico was perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but from a policy perspective, there was this idea that was dominant in Washington that we had a different responsibility to people in Mexico because they were our neighbors, and I haven't heard of that at all recently. But that's like just another way of thinking about it. A lot of times this does come down to, is a society able to kind of acknowledge the humanity of a group that they're dealing with and see them as full people who need SIM cards and dog treats? Or are they just a group who's come and trying to take advantage?
We are just past the top of the hour. One last question.
I have a question about your recent article on family separations, because as you said, I think the scariest thing to me reading it was not just what's happening, but also how not even just the general public had no idea, but even people in the government had no idea that this is going on. And I'm wondering whether during your investigation you had a chance to see how is that possible in a government that is supposed to have different layers checking into each other. How is that possible to have so little kind of knowledge of what is going on and hide it so well? And then during your work, how were you able to investigate that with this resistance being there? That makes sense.
Thank you. The way that I figured that out was quite straightforward. I sat down in interviews with people who said, I had no idea this was happening. And I said, well, didn't you know that after somebody's prosecuted, then they serve time, which means they have to go to prison, and kids can't go to prison? And they were like, no, I didn't really know that. Or didn't you know that kids are held by HHS and adults are either held by ICE or a DOJ or one of its outgrowths, depending on what part of custody they're in at a given time? And no, I didn't realize that. I mean, people who work in even people who work in specific sectors of immigration enforcement don't understand other sectors. Assistant U.S. attorneys I interviewed who prosecute immigration cases, when they started seeing separated parents, parents who were coming into court, like screaming and crying and asking for their kids, they just assumed that those parents got their kids back after the prosecution ended, because these prosecutions happen so quickly. They'll see somebody for a few hours and then never again, and just sort of assume, that some other part of the system was going to figure it out. So part of it is just how divided the system is among so many different federal agencies that don't talk to each other. But part of it is also, this is another no offense moment, I brought this up earlier today too, immigration is, I learned, not something that a lot of people in Washington are clamoring to get into. There are exceptions. There are people who work in immigration, but the issue has been intractable for so long. It's so hard to get, quote unquote, a win. One person, a high-ranking White House official in the Trump administration, said to me, there's no glory in deporting somebody. There's no glory in stopping somebody from getting asylum. And there's also no real glory, and you can kind of argue that you've secured the border, but there's no real evidence that seems to have happened either. And a lot of this does come down to, she also raised the idea of money, and she said, when you get a job in the White House, it lasts 4 years, and then you have to figure out what's next. If I focus on immigration, where was I going to work? And so she said people would come to her and ask, I was offered this high-level job at DHS. Do you think I should take it? And she would say no, because she would say, well, what are you going to do when you get out of this line of work? It's not a space where there is I guess, enough opportunity that appeals to enough people, right? Like, I raised this with an immigration lawyer I was talking to yesterday, and she said, well, yeah, but you can make a huge difference in somebody's life. Like, there are so many cases that I've won where this person wouldn't have been alive. They would have been deported and they would have been killed if I hadn't won their case. And so that's huge and meaningful on a personal level, but it's not going to make you rich. And you're still going to be, you know, sort of beating up against these very outdated immigration laws, you know, with no change in sight. Similarly, I was talking to a private lawyer. I was at a kid's Halloween party the other day, and he said, you know, just graduated from University of Chicago, and he said to me, like, this policy area isn't changing, and it's really discouraging for people who are in law school because, you know, you don't want to spend a career kind of being demoralized. Like, it's not for the faint of heart, I think, on either side. And so because you don't have as much competition, you know, you have like these small groups of people who really understand this issue, who are diametrically opposed, and then kind of nothing in between. And then the enthusiasm gap that you know, you often see even in the current administration that came out swinging on immigration and then, you know, forgot about it a few months later. You know, all those are just signals to people that it's not really worth your time to invest in this issue, and that contributes to how stuck we are and how something like family separation can come to be.
So a very sobering